This video investigates some of the barriers to self-evaluation and effective self-assessment processes. There are a range of different barriers that can impact on the ability of a student to self-evaluate their own work. These can be cultural or diversity factors. They could be their own perceptions and inertia to change and resistance to change. It could be the preparedness of that individual to undergo self-assessment and self-evaluation, but there are also logistical challenges as well. Cultural and diversity factors focus either around cultural differences between different nationalities, different cultural norms. Some of those will actively encourage self-critique, whereas others will be focused more on aligning the activity of students and learners with the experts rather than critiquing them. Institutional factors influence this as well. The institutional culture of the university or the learning environment. Some universities have active policies towards active learning and towards self-evaluation and self-critique, whereas others are less enthusiastic in that area. And finally, neurodiversity issues. So students with certain elements of neurodiversity may be more or less able to take that step out of themselves and review their own practice and their own approaches in an objective way. So that needs to be considered as a potential variation on the ability of students to evaluate themselves. The actual perceptions of the individuals involved in the process are really important. So firstly, both students and staff may be resistant to change in the types of learning activities that they're used to. Students can be just as conservative as experienced staff in this area, and there can be barriers therefore in terms of seeing self-evaluation and self-assessment as viable learning activities. Student resistance to taking on the role of the assessor is also a major issue. There's often an appreciation within students that they're there to learn and the educators are there to educate, and when you encourage them to cross that boundary to become themselves educators or assessors, often you feel resistance to that. Overemphasizing marks and grades within a self-assessment process can limit the engagement. It makes for an environment where the students will focus more on identifying a number or identifying a grade than looking at the actual qualitative elements of their work and what general areas need improvement, what general areas are done well. Finally, there's the validity of the assessment itself. Is the assessment something that is an activity that the student will be doing as part of their daily life, and therefore they need to generate that ability to evaluate their own work and evaluate their own performance? Or is it something that's an entirely artificial activity that they'll never need to develop that skill further once they graduate from their course? Preparedness for self-evaluation and self-assessment is a similar issue. So students may need development of their own assessment literacy, their understanding of the marking criteria, their understanding of the expectations of what a good quality output looks like. Developing these understandings is a very important activity in itself, and the module on subdimension AL1, understanding what good looks like, looks into this in more detail. Inadequate skills for giving feedback on the behalf of the educator or the assessor are also major problems, and in terms of supporting students in reflective activities, often feedback on reflection is something that academic staff are fairly inexperienced in providing. It could be as well that they're unfamiliar with reflective practices as a whole. This is especially true in certain disciplines where reflective practice is used less rather than objective measurement, such as the sciences. However, there are some other disciplines, such as healthcare, where self-reflection and critical appraisal of one's actions are often embedded in actual professional practices. And finally, a general lack of familiarity with reflective practice and student-led assessment can be a major challenge as well. So encouraging more engagement with the ideas of student-led assessment and student participation in assessment can help address some of those issues. The very final point is in terms of logistics. So firstly, there's the cognitive load on students. Encouraging students to evaluate themselves and understand the criteria through that evaluation can be a significant challenge to them in terms of managing their cognitive load. There are resource constraints. Often it's quite a difficult or challenging approach to take. It may require using physical resources. It may require the use of online resources in order for this to work. And the very final point is it takes time. So time constraints are often limiting the ability to embed self-assessment and self-evaluation practices within teaching activities. The key thing there is considering whether or not there is content that needs to be there and is essential to be there within that learning activity, and whether the self-assessment and self-evaluation aspects can help deliver part of that content as an assessment as learning or assessment for learning approach.